What happens when America's most seasoned political interviewer goes head-to-head with the most polarizing royal in recent history? What happens when years of built-up tension, unanswered questions, and public scrutiny finally come to a breaking point on live television? Today we're diving into one of the most shocking moments in morning television history, when George Stephanopoulos made Meghan Markle break down in tears during what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview on Good Morning America. If you want to see how this incredible confrontation unfolded word by word, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think really happened behind the scenes. The studio lights were blazing hot that morning as George Stephanopoulos shuffled his notes one final time. Across from him sat Meghan Markle, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored blazer, her trademark confident smile firmly in place. We're rolling live to millions of viewers across America. And what started as a standard celebrity interview was about to become something nobody saw coming. George leaned forward slightly, his decades of experience evident in his calm demeanor. "Meghan, thank you for joining us this morning. I know you're here to talk about your new charitable initiative, but I think our viewers would appreciate some clarity on a few other matters first." Meghan's smile flickered for just a moment, barely perceptible to most, but George caught it. "Of course, George. I'm an open book, as always. Are you, though?" George's question hung in the air like a challenge, because over the past few years, there have been quite a few inconsistencies in various interviews and statements. For instance, you've spoken about feeling isolated and unsupported. Yet palace sources suggest extensive resources were made available to you. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop. Meghan straightened in her chair, her media training kicking in. "George, I think it's important to distinguish between resources being offered and resources being accessible. Having a team of people around you doesn't mean you have genuine support when you're struggling. But surely you understood what you were walking into," George pressed, his voice remaining steady but pointed. This wasn't exactly a surprise, was it? The scrutiny, the protocol, the expectations. "I understood there would be challenges, yes, but I don't think anyone can truly prepare for the level of—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Intensity that comes with this particular role." George nodded slowly, then reached for a specific sheet of paper from his stack. "Let's talk about intensity. You've made several statements about feeling unsupported during your mental health struggles. Yet we've obtained correspondence that suggests multiple offers of help were made. Can you explain the disconnect there, for the first time?" Composure wavered visibly. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, began to fidget with her engagement ring. "I'm sorry, correspondence. What correspondence are you referring to?" "Internal palace communications that detail various meetings, therapy options, and support systems that were put in place. Are you saying you weren't aware of these efforts?" The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Viewers at home could practically feel the tension through their screens. Meghan's throat worked as she swallowed, clearly buying time to formulate her response. "George, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what constitutes genuine help versus what might look good on paper. Yes, meetings happened. Yes, options were discussed. But when you're in crisis, when you're genuinely struggling, the gap between bureaucratic process and actual human compassion can feel insurmountable." "But these weren't bureaucratic processes," George countered, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "These were personal interventions, family members reaching out, professional counselors being made available immediately. Are you suggesting none of this registered as genuine care?" Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm suggesting that when you're dealing with an institution that has operated the same way for centuries, change doesn't happen quickly, even when people have good intentions." "So the institution failed you?" "I wouldn't say failed exactly. Then what would you say?" The question hung heavy between them. George's years of interviewing politicians had taught him the power of the uncomfortable pause, and he wielded it expertly now. Meghan shifted in her seat, her polished exterior beginning to show hairline cracks. "I would say that sometimes good intentions aren't enough when systems haven't evolved to meet modern challenges." George leaned back slightly, studying her face. "That's a very diplomatic answer, but we're talking about your mental health, your well-being. When you say the institution didn't fail you, but the systems hadn't evolved, what does that actually mean for someone in your position It means, Meghan began, then stopped. She looked down at her hands, then back up at George. It means that you can be surrounded by protocol and process and still feel completely alone. But you weren't alone, were you? You had Harry. The mention of her husband's name seemed to hit differently. Meghan's carefully maintained composure slipped another notch. Yes, I had Harry. But Harry was dealing with his own struggles, his own complicated relationship with his family and his role. So he couldn't support you. He did everything he could, but it wasn't enough. Another long pause. The studio audience, usually filled with the soft murmur of producers and crew, was dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to lean, in slightly sensing something significant was about to happen. George, I think you're oversimplifying a very complex situation, am I? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you're describing a family and an institution that made multiple attempts to help, and you're saying those attempts weren't adequate. I'm trying to understand what would have been adequate. Meghan's breathing became slightly more visible, her chest rising and falling with what appeared to be increasing emotion. What would have been adequate would have been acknowledgement that the situation was unprecedented. What would have been adequate would have been flexibility in how things were handled. Unprecedented how? Come on, George. You know exactly. How? I'd like you to tell me. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a confrontation, and both participants knew it. Meghan's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been hurt. Because I was the first person in that family who looked like me. Because the media coverage was unlike anything that had come before. Because the level of scrutiny and criticism was amplified in ways that had racial undertones, whether people want to acknowledge that or not. George nodded slowly. So you're saying the treatment was different because of your race? I'm saying the context was different. And that context wasn't adequately considered in how support was offered or how the situation was managed. But surely that context was obvious to everyone involved from the beginning. You would think, so wouldn't you? The sarcasm in her voice was slight but unmistakable, and George pounced on it immediately. So you're suggesting that your husband's family, people who have spent their lives in the public eye, somehow failed to anticipate or prepare for the unique challenges you would face. I'm suggesting that anticipating something and adequately preparing for it are two very different things. And they didn't adequately prepare. Clearly not, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. George set down his papers deliberately, a gesture that seemed to signal a shift in the interview's tone. Meghan, with respect, you're dancing around some very direct questions here. Either the family and the institution provided adequate support during a difficult time, or they didn't. Which is it? The silence that followed George's direct challenge stretched uncomfortably long. Meghan's hands had moved from fidgeting with her ring to gripping the arms of her chair, her knuckles showing the faintest hint of white beneath her polished exterior. That's not a fair characterization of what I'm saying, she finally responded, but her voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. Then help me understand what you were saying, George replied, his tone remaining professionally courteous, but relentless. Because what I'm hearing is that despite multiple documented attempts at support, despite family members expressing concern, despite professional resources being made available, somehow the response was inadequate. I'm trying to reconcile that. With your earlier statements about feeling completely abandoned, Meghan took a breath that was deeper than she probably intended, visible to the millions watching live. George, I never said I felt completely abandoned, didn't you? Because I have the transcript right here from your previous interview, where you said, and I quote, "There were times when I felt like I had nowhere to turn, like I was completely on my own in this situation." That sounds like abandonment to me. The fact that he had her exact words seemed to catch Meghan off guard. She blinked several times in rapid succession, a tell that George's trained eye immediately picked up on. Context matters. George, those words were describing specific moments, not the entirety of my experience. Specific moments when the support system failed. Specific moments when I felt overwhelmed despite the support that existed. So the support did exist. Some support existed, yes. But earlier you suggested it didn't exist, or wasn't accessible. No, I suggested there was a difference between support existing on paper and support being effectively delivered. George, leaned forward slightly, sensing an opening. "Meghan, you're a very intelligent woman. You've built a successful career. You understand how organizations work. Are you telling me that you were unable to effectively communicate your needs to people who were trying to help you?" The question hit like a precision strike. Meghan's composed facade flickered more noticeably now, and for the first time, viewers could see something raw beneath the surface. She started, then stopped. "That's not what I'm saying at all." Then what prevented effective communication? Because either your needs were clearly expressed and ignored, or they weren't clearly expressed. Which scenario are we talking about? It's not that simple. Why isn't it that simple? The rapid-fire questioning was clearly taking its toll. Meghan's breathing had become more shallow, and she unconsciously touched her throat, a gesture that spoke to mounting stress. Because when you're in crisis, when you're struggling with your mental health, sometimes it's difficult to articulate exactly what you need. And sometimes the people around you, no matter how well-intentioned, don't know how to interpret or respond to what you're going through. But surely Harry knew how to interpret what you were going through. Harry was doing his best. That's not what I asked. I asked if he knew how to interpret what you were going through. Another pause, this one filled with tension so thick it was almost visible. Meghan's eyes had developed a slight glassiness that hadn't been there at the start of the interview. Harry was dealing with his own complicated relationship with his family, so he couldn't help you navigate yours. It wasn't my family, George, that's the point. But it became your family when you married into it. Did it, though? The question came out more bitter than she probably intended, and George pounced on the emotional crack immediately. What do you mean by that? Meghan seemed to realize she'd revealed more than she meant to. She sat back in her chair, trying to regain some composure, but the damage was done. The polished exterior was crumbling in real time. I mean that becoming part of a family and being accepted as part of a family are two different things. So you felt you weren't accepted. I felt like I was tolerated. The honesty of the statement seemed to surprise even her. George, recognizing the significance of the moment, pressed forward carefully but firmly. Tolerated by whom? She stopped, seeming to weigh her words carefully. By the institution, not by individual family members. The institution and the individual family members aren't always separate entities. George, that's something I had to learn. Weigh? What does that mean exactly? It means that sometimes people you want to have personal relationships with are constrained by institutional expectations and protocols in ways that make genuine intimacy nearly impossible. Are we talking about your relationship with your husband's father? Meghan's composure took another visible hit. Her hands moved to her lap, fingers interlacing and gripping tightly. I'd rather not get into specifics about individual relationships. Why not? You've spoken about these relationships publicly before. I've spoken about my experience, which is different from speaking about other people's actions or motivations. But your experience included interactions with specific people, didn't it? Of course it did. So help me understand. When you felt unsupported, who specifically was failing to provide that support? The question hung in the air like a sword. Meghan looked down at her hands, then back up at George, and, for the first time, viewers could see her eyes beginning to well up with unshed tears. George, I think you're trying to get me to say something that would be hurtful to people I care about. I'm trying to get you to be specific about claims you've made publicly. If you felt unsupported, if you felt the institution failed you, surely you can identify where that failure occurred. The failure occurred, she began, her voice becoming noticeably thicker. In the inability to recognize that I needed something different from what had always been done before. Different how? Different in terms of understanding that my background, my experience, my perspective, brought unique challenges that required adapted responses. And when you communicated these unique challenges, what was the response? The response was often that this was how things had always been done, and I needed to adapt to the system rather than the system adapting to accommodate my needs. Sensed he was getting closer to something significant. Who said that to you? Meghan's eyes were definitely watering now, though she was fighting hard to maintain control. It wasn't always said directly, George. Sometimes it was communicated through action or inaction. But someone must have said it directly at some point. Yes, she whispered, so quietly that viewers had to strain to hear. Who? The single? Word question seemed to break something inside her. Meghan's carefully constructed composure finally began to crumble visibly. A single tear rolled down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away, but the cameras caught it all. "I can't," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I can't put individual people in that position by naming them specifically, even if they put you in an impossible position." Especially then, George leaned back slightly, recognizing that he'd pushed her to a breaking point, but not wanting to let up entirely. "Meghan, you've made very serious allegations about how you were treated. You've suggested that racism played a role, that support was inadequate, that you felt abandoned and isolated. But when asked for specifics, you retreat into generalities. Don't you think the public deserves more concrete information?" The tears were flowing more freely now, though Meghan was still trying to maintain some semblance of composure. Her voice, when she spoke, was thick with emotion. "The public deserves honesty about my experience, but that doesn't mean I have to destroy individual relationships or put specific people on trial in the court of public opinion." "But isn't that exactly what you did in your previous interviews?" The question hit like a physical blow. Meghan's face crumpled slightly, and she had to take several seconds to compose herself enough to respond. Meghan sat frozen for a moment, the weight of George's accusation settling over her like a heavy blanket. The tears that had been threatening throughout the interview were now flowing freely, and her attempts to wipe them away only seemed to make them more obvious to the millions of viewers watching this breakdown unfold in real time. "That's not," she began, then stopped, her voice catching. "That's not what I intended to do." George's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried the weight of years of investigative journalism. "But isn't that the inevitable result? When you go on national television and describe feeling abandoned, unsupported, and isolated, aren't you inherently putting the people responsible for that situation on trial?" "I was trying to share my truth," Meghan said, her voice barely above. A whisper now. "Your truth or the truth." The distinction hit her like a slap. Her composure, which had been hanging by a thread, finally snapped completely. The tears came harder now, and her shoulders began to shake with the effort of trying to contain her emotions. "George, please," she managed through the tears. But George, sensing this was the moment of complete breakthrough, didn't relent. "Meghan, either what you've described happened as you say it did, or it didn't. Either you were treated unfairly, or you weren't. Either the institution failed you, or it didn't. Which is it?" "It's complicated," she sobbed, no longer able to maintain any pretense of control. What's complicated about it? Because she struggled to get the words out through her tears, because maybe some of it was my fault too. The admission hung in the air like a confession. George leaned forward, recognizing the significance of what she'd just revealed. "What was your fault?" Meghan covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. When she finally looked up, her makeup was streaked, her carefully styled appearance completely undone. "Maybe I didn't try hard enough to fit in. Maybe I was too quick to assume the worst when things got difficult. Maybe I expected too much, too soon." "Are you saying your previous statements were inaccurate?" "I'm saying," she paused, wiping her nose with a tissue that a producer had quietly placed within reach. "I'm saying that when you're hurt and angry, you don't always see the whole picture clearly." George's voice softened slightly, but he didn't let up on the pressure. "So what is the whole picture, Meghan?" She took a shuddering breath, trying to compose herself enough to speak coherently. "The whole picture is that I walked into a situation that I thought I understood, but I didn't. The whole picture is that I had expectations that weren't realistic. The whole picture is that when things got hard, I looked for people to blame, instead of looking at what I could do differently so the institution didn't fail you. The institution," she said, her voice still thick with tears, "the institution is what it is. It's been the same for hundreds of years. I can't expect it to change just because I arrived." "What about the people in that institution? Your husband's family?" This question brought fresh tears, and Meghan's voice broke again as she answered. "They tried, George, in their own way, within the constraints of what they knew how to do. They tried, and she sobbed harder. "I wasn't fair to them." "In what way weren't you fair?" "I expected them to understand things they'd never had to understand before. I expected them to change their entire way of operating because it didn't work for me. I expected them to prioritize my comfort over centuries of tradition and protocol." George studied her face carefully. "Are you saying the racism allegations were unfounded?" The question made her flinch visibly. She covered her face again, crying so hard now that her whole body was shaking. "I don't know," she whispered through her hands. "I thought at the time I believed, but now I don't know if what I interpreted as racism was just people not knowing how to handle a situation they'd never encountered before. So you may have been wrong. I may have been wrong about some things. Yes." The admission seemed to drain something out of her. She slumped back in her chair, looking suddenly smaller and more vulnerable than she had at any point in the interview. George pressed forward gently, but persistently. "What about your husband? Was he supportive?" Fresh tears spilled over at the mention of Harry. Harry was caught in an impossible position. I put him in an impossible position. He was trying to support me, while also trying to maintain relationships with his family. And she paused, struggling. With the words, "I made him choose." How did you make him choose? By making everything about us versus them. By not being willing to compromise or adapt. By making him feel like he had to pick a side instead of helping him find ways to bridge the gap. Do you regret that now? The question brought the hardest sob yet. Meghan doubled over in her chair, completely overcome with emotion. When she finally managed to speak, her words were barely audible. "I regret so much, George. I regret not trying harder. I regret not being more patient. I regret not understanding that change takes time. I regret hurting people who didn't deserve to be hurt." George waited for her crying to subside slightly before asking his next question. "Do you regret the previous interviews where you made these allegations?" She looked up at him, her face completely streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. "I regret that I spoke from a place of pain instead of a place of understanding. I regret that my words hurt people I love. I regret that I contributed to a narrative that may not have been entirely accurate." "Are you saying you lied?" "I'm saying that my truth at the time may not have been the complete truth. I'm saying that when you're hurting, you don't always see things clearly. I'm saying that I wish I had waited, had taken more time to process everything before speaking publicly." George's next question was delivered with surgical precision. "If you could speak to your husband's family now, what would you say?" This broke her completely. Meghan dissolved into the kind of crying that comes from deep in the soul, the kind that can't be controlled or contained. She was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, let alone speak. I would say she gasped through the tears. I would say, "I'm sorry." I would say, "I know I made mistakes." I would say, "I know I hurt them, and that was never what I wanted." I would say, "I wish we could start over, but I know that's probably not possible now." Why isn't it possible? Because she struggled to get the words out, because some things can't be unsaid, some damage can't be undone, some trust, once broken, can't be rebuilt. George leaned back in his chair, watching as this accomplished. Articulate woman completely fell apart before millions of viewers. "Meghan, do you think this interview will help or hurt your relationships with your husband's family?" She looked at him through her tears, seeming to truly consider the question. "I don't know. I hope that may be showing that I can acknowledge my mistakes, that I can take responsibility for my part in what went wrong. Maybe that's a step toward healing. And if it's not," the question seemed to drain the last of her energy. She slumped forward, her head in her hands, crying quietly but steadily. "Then at least I'll know I told the whole truth this time, not just my version of it." George glanced at his notes one final time, then looked directly into the camera. "We'll be right back after this break." As the cameras cut away, viewers were left with the image of Meghan Markle, once confident and composed, now completely broken down, tears streaming down her face as the weight of her admissions settled over her. The interview that was supposed to be about her charitable work had instead become a raw, emotional reckoning, with choices and consequences that had changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. This was the moment that would be replayed endlessly, analyzed by experts, and debated by viewers around the world. This was the moment when one of the most polarizing figures in recent royal history finally cracked under the pressure of her own contradictions and revealed the vulnerable, flawed human being underneath the public persona. What did you think about this incredible breakdown? Was George too harsh, or was this the accountability moment that needed to happen? Let me know in the comments below what you think Meghan's next move should be, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the most shocking moments in celebrity interviews.